I moved into the little beige corner house on Mayfair Lane thinking I'd finally escape the chaos of downtown life. A place where the loudest sound would be sprinklers ticking at dawn, not sirens screaming past cracked pavement. And for a while, it felt like I had. That is, until Karen entered my life, wrapped in yoga pants, sunglasses, and a pathological sense of suburban entitlement. She was the kind of HOA president who walked around with a clipboard that might as well have been forged from the bones of previous homeowners, nitpicking grass height, mailbox angles, and the color temperature of porch lights like she was curating a museum exhibit on boring perfection. But I kept my head down, followed the rules, paid my dues, and poured all my energy into what became my sanctuary, a 20 by 12-foot backyard garden that I built from the soil up with my own hands, a little slice of self-sustaining heaven. I didn't do it for show or for community points. I did it because after years of burnout, I needed to reconnect with something simple and real. So I grew tomatoes, zucchini, bell peppers, cucumbers, green beans, and a patch of sweet corn, watching them rise in defiance of the concrete cubicles I'd escaped. For the first couple of months, it was just me and the plants. I'd water them in the early morning, sip my coffee beside the tomato vines, and feel something I hadn't felt in years, peace. Then, around mid-June, I noticed something odd. A zucchini that had been nearly ready for harvest was missing. I brushed it off at first, thought maybe I'd picked it and forgot, or maybe a raccoon had gotten bold. But over the next week, more began to vanish, 3 bell peppers one day, 2 ears of corn the next. I tightened the fencing, double-checked the latch on the back gate, and even set up a cheap wildlife camera from the local hardware store. What I found nearly made me choke on my morning coffee. There, in full color, was Karen, my HOA Karen, wearing a wide-brimmed sun hat and gardening gloves, casually slipping into my backyard like she was harvesting from her own raised beds, filling a wicker basket with my produce like some deranged reverse vegetable Santa. I sat in stunned silence as I watched the footage again, noting how she even paused to taste a cherry tomato, nod in approval, and walk off without a care in the world. The next morning, I confronted her. I walked right up to her door and knocked until she opened it, looking surprised to see me, probably expecting some poor sap begging for permission to repaint their shutters. I held up my phone and played the footage without a word. Her expression didn't falter. If anything, she smiled like I'd just shown her a puppy. "Oh, that," she said, as if being caught stealing was no big deal. "I assumed you were sharing." The HOA guidelines do encourage neighborly generosity. I stared at her, dumbfounded. "You broke into my backyard," I said. "That's trespassing. Theft." She rolled her eyes. "Don't be dramatic. You have so much. I'm just trimming a little excess. Besides, your fencing isn't up to code anyway. It doesn't meet the HOA-approved height-to-lattice ratio." I couldn't believe it. She not only admitted it, she was rationalizing it, twisting bylaws and fake regulations into a justification for burglary like some kind of legal garden ninja. When I pushed back, she smirked. "If you have a problem, take it up with the HOA. Then she shut the door in my face. So I did. I submitted a formal complaint with photo and video evidence. I wrote a detailed statement. I followed every bureaucratic step like a good little citizen. 2 weeks later, I got the response. After review, the HOA has determined that this matter falls outside the scope of enforceable community policy. We encourage open sharing of resources and believe neighborly disputes are best resolved civilly. I nearly tore the letter in half. Civilly? She broke into my yard and ate my vegetables. I tried calling, but the HOA office went straight to voicemail. I sent emails. No reply. Karen, of course, strutted around like she'd won a prize, even had the audacity to drop a laminated flyer in everyone's mailbox the next day, titled 5 Ways to Encourage Garden Sharing. She'd weaponized public image and HOA structure into a fortress of plausible deniability, and I realized, with a slow-burning fury, that nothing short of an act of God or an attorney with an appetite for niche property law was going to stop her. She wasn't just stealing food, she was stealing control, rewriting my personal space into community property like I'd sign away the soil with my HOA dues. That's when I stopped trying to reason with the system and started thinking like a gardener. Because in nature, balance isn't restored by bureaucracy. It's restored by adaptation, by consequences. I couldn't take her to court without draining my savings. I couldn't rely on the HOA, she was the HOA, and confronting her again would just feed her ego. But what I could do, what I realized I should do, was defend my territory in the one language I knew Karen didn't speak, botany. She saw vegetables. She saw free food. But she didn't see plants. She didn't see leaves, stems, species, toxins. And that, I thought, gave me the edge. I didn't want to hurt her. I didn't even want to cause permanent damage. I just wanted her to stop, to learn, to feel what happens when you cross someone who's had enough. So I took a trip to a nursery just outside city limits, one that didn't mind questions like, "Do you have any ornamental ground cover that's slightly irritating to the touch?" The man behind the counter smiled knowingly. "You want poison ivy?" And I smiled back. The thing about dealing with someone like Karen is that it's not just the theft. It's the way she weaponizes smugness as a form of psychological warfare, like she expects your outrage to wither under the force of her laminated bylaws and lemon-scented superiority. And for a while, I'll admit, mine almost did. After the HOA dismissed my complaint, she wasted no time making her next move, this time with a smile so wide it practically oozed condescension, as if daring me to swing back in a fight she thought I'd already lost. Within days, I received my first official citation. Improper fencing installation. Fence does not conform to approved aesthetic design. A ridiculous accusation considering the fence had been up for 5 years and approved during the previous HOA administration. But that was just the beginning. Next came a warning for non-compliant compost storage, followed by a $150 fine for unlicensed decorative lawn elements, which, according to the attached photo, referred to a single metal rooster statue my mother had given me as a housewarming gift. I stared at that rooster in disbelief for a full 5 minutes before realizing that Karen wasn't even pretending to be subtle anymore. She declared war, not with fire, but with paperwork. It became routine. Every morning, I'd check my mailbox and find a new envelope from the HOA, each one a slap in the face disguised as a courtesy notification. I was fined for mulch that was too red, for garden stakes exceeding height maximums, even for tomato trellis that allegedly resembled construction scaffolding. When I appealed the fines, I was informed that the board had unanimously denied the appeal, even though several of those board members hadn't attended a meeting in months. The HOA had become Karen's personal kingdom, and her thirst for control was endless. She'd go on neighborhood walks with her clipboard and phone, snapping pictures of people's yards like a paparazzo at a garden center. It wasn't just about keeping things tidy, it was about domination. About asserting that she decided what was acceptable and what wasn't. I watched her turn the neighborhood into a miniature dictatorship, and yet, through it all, I smiled. I waved. I played the role of the harmless gardener. Because by then, my plan was already growing in the ground. I'd returned from the nursery with several discrete flats of poison ivy, Toxicodendron radicans, if we're being scientific, and a bit of advice from the nursery owner: it spreads fast. Put it where someone dumb might step. I went to work under cover of darkness, transplanting the vines in precise clusters around the perimeter of my raised beds, and especially in the areas where Karen had previously accessed the garden. I didn't want it to look suspicious or malicious. I wanted it to look accidental, natural, like wild growth. I interlaced the poison ivy with some fast-growing green beans and ornamental sweet potato vines to give the area a lush, busy look. Then, for good measure, I updated my garden journal with new notes, printed and laminated a sign that read "Caution, experimental plants, do not touch," and staked it in plain view, not because I thought Karen would obey it, but because I wanted her to ignore it. People like her see boundaries not as warnings, but as challenges. She couldn't help herself. Meanwhile, her antics only escalated. She started sending emails to the neighborhood about unruly yards and excess vegetable hoarding, a term so ridiculous it made my neighbor Greg nearly choke on his morning donut. Karen even cornered an elderly woman at the mailbox and warned her that unsanctioned flower boxes could lower property values. It was like watching a petty tyrant unravel in slow motion, her grip tightening as more and more people began to quietly resent her. But no one dared to cross her, not publicly. That's what made her so dangerous. People would roll their eyes behind closed doors but smile and nod when she walked by, afraid that saying something would get them slapped with a violation for owning off-brand fertilizer. The HOA was her shield and sword, and she wielded both with relentless pettiness. Except now she had a blind spot in me. She thought she'd broken me. She thought the citations and fines had worn me down to the point of submission. She thought that just because I wasn't shouting, I was silent. But I'd simply changed tactics. You can't fight fire with fire when the other side owns the matches and the fire department. You fight it with nature. With patience. With itchy, blistering karma. I monitored the ivy carefully, making sure it didn't spread too far, keeping gloves in my shed and washing everything religiously after working near the perimeter. I trimmed it strategically, just enough to keep it looking like unintentional growth, while letting the oil seep into the soil around the most trafficked areas of the garden path. It was a waiting game, and Karen, true to form, walked right into it. It happened one humid Thursday afternoon, just as the tomatoes were turning plump and red. I'd gone to the hardware store for an hour and came back to find a familiar pattern of boot prints in the soft soil. Several tomatoes were missing. A few green beans had been clipped. And there, in the dirt near the zucchini bed, were pieces of snapped ivy vine. I smiled, not out of malice, but because I knew what was coming. Poison ivy doesn't always strike instantly. It can take hours, even a day, before the itching begins. But when it does, it doesn't just itch, it burns. I washed up as usual, gloves off, hands scrubbed, and waited. That night, the HOA message board lit up with a new post from Karen titled Urgent Neighborhood Plant Infestation, in which she claimed she had suffered a severe allergic reaction from potentially invasive foliage and warned everyone to report suspicious vines. She never admitted she'd been in my yard. She never mentioned the theft. But I knew. And the best part, so did several neighbors. One even commented, "Weird how it happened right after the tomatoes started ripening." Another added, "Maybe leave people's gardens alone." The tide was beginning to turn. Karen, once untouchable, was starting to look fallible, foolish, and itchy. She stopped doing her daily HOA patrols. She started wearing long sleeves in 90-degree weather. Her yard began to wilt, flower beds untrimmed, hedges leaning, her own grass suddenly half an inch too long. The queen of order was starting to crack. And I kept watering. I kept harvesting. I kept waving. Because nature had spoken. And the best was still to come. When it finally happened, when Karen reached her breaking point, it wasn't with a scream or a fine or one of her infamous wide emails demanding everyone repaint their fences 3 shades paler. No, it was something quieter, something more pathetic, like a balloon slowly losing air and farting its way across a room until it hits the wall and drops to the ground in utter defeat. It began with her front lawn, which went from immaculate golf course green to patchy and uneven, dotted with bare spots and yellowing edges, because Karen, for all her authority, no longer had the nerve to walk to the curb without long sleeves, gloves, and an oversized sun hat like she was preparing for a biohazard zone. She'd stopped tending her flower beds completely, letting her once pristine rows of impatiens grow lopsided and wild. The rosebush she used to trim with near-religious fervor now sagged onto the sidewalk like it had given up hope. Rumors started flying that Karen had seen a dermatologist 3 times in 1 week, that she was on prescription steroid creams, that her right leg had swollen so badly she couldn't wear heels anymore, which was why she started waddling to her car in knockoff Crocs like a day's mall walker. The HOA meetings grew sparse, then non-existent. Her leadership title remained, but she no longer sent agendas, no longer handed out citations, no longer walked the neighborhood with that judgmental glare she'd used like a laser pointer on anything fun or colorful. For the first time in months, years, really, there was a kind of peace in the neighborhood, a freedom in the air like someone had finally lifted a boot from everyone's neck. Kids played on the sidewalks again. Their chalk drawings sprawled past the arbitrary 2-foot margin Karen used to enforce like a prison warden. People began putting up little lawn decorations again, frogs, flamingos, even a windmill spinner shaped like a taco. I watched it all unfold from my porch, hose in hand, garden lush and thriving, every tomato and pepper a monument to quiet resistance. But the real climax, the true, sticky, unforgettable harvest, came 2 weeks later when Karen tried to get back what she believed was hers. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was denial. Maybe she truly believed that if she could just get one more basket of produce, things would reset, and her place at the top of the HOA food chain would magically be restored. Whatever the reason, she struck again on a Monday afternoon when I wasn't home. At least, that's what she thought. In reality, I was in the garage fixing a broken mower bell when I heard the unmistakable creak of the garden gate. I peeked through the corner of my workshop window, and there she was, crouched among the raised beds, wearing oversized gloves and a wide-brimmed hat, moving quickly, furtively, like someone who knew they were doing something wrong but believed the rules didn't apply. She didn't just pick a few veggies this time. She filled a canvas tote with cucumbers, corn, tomatoes, even snipped a handful of herbs like she was restocking a Whole Foods cart. And then, the moment happened. She reached just past the tomato vines, into the area where the poison ivy had grown thickest, camouflage among sweet potato greens and a false parsley trellis, and with a casual swipe, she brushed the full length of her forearm against the vine, not once but twice, dragging it along the underside of her exposed wrist and inner elbow. I saw it. I winced. But I didn't stop her. She stood, adjusted the bag over her shoulder, and walked off without looking back, a thief in sunlight, blissfully unaware that she just sealed her own fate. By the next morning, the consequences had bloomed faster than anything I'd planted that season. She showed up in her front yard in a frenzy, scratching her arms violently through a layer of gauze and medical tape. Her hands looked like she'd tried to catch a hornet with her bare fists, red, raw, swollen beyond recognition. Her skin was streaked with angry welts, some oozing, some wrapped in bandages that looked like they hadn't been changed properly in days. She tried to play it off at first, sitting on her porch with a tall glass of lemon water, like she was just taking a break, but everyone could see she was miserable. The postman wouldn't get within 10 feet of her. Even the neighborhood cat, usually fearless, gave her a wide berth like she smelled wrong. Then came the scratching, relentless, furious, visible from across the street. She'd scratch her arms, her neck, her face, pacing back and forth like an animal trapped in its own skin. And that's when the neighborhood really started talking. The McCartys whispered that she'd been using someone else's garden again. The Johnsons said they knew she hadn't gotten permission. And my neighbor Greg, bless his blunt honesty, just said what everyone else was thinking. That's what she gets for being a greedy, power-hungry parasite. The phrase stuck. The gossip turned to jokes. Someone added caution, do not feed the HOA to the community board. A homemade sign appeared on her lawn one morning that read, Property of Nature, touch and learn. And then, in the final, most glorious twist of irony, Karen received her first official HOA fine, not from herself, of course, but from the interim president who'd stepped in to keep the books balanced while Karen nursed her wounds. The offense: unauthorized harvesting from private property. The amount: $500. The payment deadline: immediate. She was livid. I heard the yelling through closed windows. But it didn't matter. Her power was gone. Her control was gone. And her arms, still wrapped in layers of gauze, looked like they were trying to climb off her body to escape her mistakes. By the end of summer, Karen listed her house. The listing was vague, charming community home with mature landscaping and cooperative neighbors. She dropped the price twice. No buyers. The garden next door, meanwhile, my garden, became the highlight of the block. People asked for tips. I gave them freely. I even started sharing my harvest in label baskets left on a folding table by the sidewalk, complete with a handwritten sign that said, please take what you like. Just don't trespass. And not one person did. Because unlike Karen, I'd earned trust, not through rules or threats, but through kindness backed with a quiet, leafy warning. Eventually, a nice retired couple bought Karen's house. They pulled the dead rosebush, repainted the shutters a cheerful green, and even asked me to help them start a garden of their own. I brought over seedlings, tomatoes, cucumbers, zucchini, and taught them how to spot poison ivy, just in case. And on the last night of summer, I sat on my porch, watching the sky fade into pink and gold, the air thick with the scent of ripe tomatoes and honeysuckle, and thought, that's the thing about people like Karen. They think the rules don't apply to them. They think they can take and take without consequence. But nature doesn't forget. It always finds a way to bite back. And sometimes it itches for weeks.